right, this is the Source Needed podcast. I'm Liz.
I'm Abby.
And today we're going to be talking a little bit about fascism.
Yep.
Fascist architecture.
Fascism, but make it architecture.
Yeah.
And this was my kind of idea that I came up with, because that's another thing maybe we haven't mentioned. We both alternate in terms of...
For the moment, yeah.
Proposing what topic we want to discuss.
Maybe at some point we will ask our lovely listeners to decide a topic for us. And if you want to be part of that, you gotta follow us on Instagram.
That's true.
Ayo.
Mm-hmm. So I was really inspired by reading, or I guess I knew that this had taken place in the past, but basically, as we all know, Donald Trump is back in office and he's back with his presidential decrees, including the promoting beautiful federal civic architecture. What is it? A presidential, oh my gosh, I'm blanking.
Decree,
executive order.
Executive order, yeah. He's been doing a lot of those.
This was one of the flurry of executive orders that came.
They released so many at the same time so that you don't pay attention to all of them. That's the trick.
That was the trick. And this is one of the many. But this one is in similar vein as his last term. Also kind of mandating that federal public buildings should be visually identifiable, and they should uplift and beautify public spaces and ennoble the United States and our system of self-government.
I love the wording of things because they make it sound very reasonable, and who would have any problem with that? But it's hiding something that's potentially more nefarious.
I love the word nefarious.
Yeah.
Because I think it is nefarious. I think architecture, like any art form, has gone through a really interesting kind of development over time. I think initially we see, of course, during the Renaissance, kind of this repopularization of kind of classical architecture, and
ancient Greece and Rome.
Exactly. The typical the columns, the arches, the white marble, like all of these things obviously are very important for, or I guess certain systems of government like to build in that style because it recalls kind of the power of Rome or the democratic system of Greece, which of course is also ironic.
It includes you in a larger narrative that you want to align yourself with.
Yeah, and so I proposed to Liz, like, let's talk about this because I think there's a lot to unpack, and I'm really curious also what your thoughts are on this executive order, and is there a positive side of promoting, I guess, a uniform system of aesthetics in a nation's capital or country at large, or indeed is there something kind of scary about that? Or is it actually true that people prefer classical architecture to other styles? I don't know.
That's certainly the argument that they've made in this decree.
Yeah.
They're very willy-nilly, like sections of the actual text that they've used in this executive order are included in the article that Abby's chosen, which is by, I don't have it included on mine.
By Julia Friedman, and it was published in the Athenaeum Review.
Okay.
Am I saying that right?
Athenaeum?
Yeah, Athenaeum Review. Yes, PhD from Brown University, art historian. And I thought this was really interesting because she kind of also breaks down like where this obsession with classical architecture comes from and like why certain governments have valued that style of architecture over, let's say, a brutalist style or an Art Deco style or a constructivist style. So yeah, I thought it was timely and important to talk about this, seeing that it's going to be relevant again in the US
for the next few years, potentially the next 8 years. But she actually quotes the text that is in this executive order, and just the language is so matter of fact, as though, yes, this is ugly and this is not, and everyone agrees about it. And don't worry about checking that out. We just have to make sure that none of this ugly stuff gets built and that we're properly representing America. There was actually a section of it that was talking about the sources that they used in the executive order. Like one of the sources that they used was Wikipedia.
I love it.
They needed to listen to Source Needed for sure. We do a better job than that. I know. Mean, come on.
I feel like at least, even if it's after the fact, there's usually, well, the sources are quality, I would say.
We choose good sources, yeah.
And if we reference something, like the source we're referencing is usually of a certain caliber. Yeah.
Existing is good.
It's not Wikipedia.
No. Although we love Wikipedia, go donate.
True. I was like, that usually is like where I begin any type of research, or I used to make. I mean, I guess now AI is also a big.
It's just the laziness of the administration and the ineptitude as well. But let's get beyond that and into the architecture of it all.
So I guess like some of the buildings that are criticized by the Trump administration are, for example, the headquarters of the U.S. Department of Health and Education in D.C., which is a building designed by Marcel Breuer. You can see it here. We'll also put it in if you're watching online on YouTube. I mean, this is a very Breuer style building. It reminds me a lot of the former American embassy in The Hague, which is also designed by Breuer. Hey, am I like the biggest fan? No, I think if you were working at this building, like there is something maybe a little bit mundane about it. I mean, this is really like from a time when these kind of gray symmetrical buildings were very much in fashion. And I mean, sometimes they do offer a very stark contrast to a more classical building, like if we think about the Supreme Court. But I would argue they have their place, and it's very important to kind of see trace the lineage of architecture and how it evolves over time. And
I don't like the idea of trying to eliminate any part of history or, censor anything, and especially going forward, say that there has to be a one type of aesthetic that we're going to identify as being part of this era now and going forward. And these buildings as well, they are in the brutalist style. So brutalism emerged around World War II in Europe, and then it came to America. It came out of the Bauhaus architectural movement as well. And one of the defining features of it is like this geometric appearance, as well as the use of this material, concrete. And concrete is a really big part of the brutalist style, and it creates these very monochromatic buildings that people think are a bit of an eyesore. I think that there's beauty to be found in some brutalist buildings. I do enjoy them. Not all, but it is interesting how often brutalist architecture is used in popular media as a direct parallel for some kind of dystopian fascist society. Like they use brutalism in the Hunger Games and Catching Fire. Like there was a very famous brutalist area that they I'll put the architectural guy here because I don't know what it is, so source needed.
There's also an Instagram account, I'm looking it up, that is just featuring brutalist architecture. Let's see. Well, I think is it at Brutal Architecture at Source Needed? We will also put that here
and the show notes.
I mean, the fun thing I think about brutalism is that you also have a lot of it in Eastern Europe, actually. And I think there is something really cool and kind of futuristic about it as well, and it's kind of dystopian. And I think it would be such a shame to kind of eliminate any variety in architectural design. I mean, even
innovation,
right? Just to continue repurposing the same old formulaic
neoclassical
thing. Like we've already done that. Like we did that in the Renaissance. We did it again in the 18th and early 19th century with the neoclassicist movement. Like how many times are we going to continue reiterating the same style? Is there not also space for, I guess, also making sure that our designs are ecologically friendly and sustainable? The article also goes into the fact that if we wanted to recreate you know, these kind of grand ancient Roman buildings in the same way and actually do them justice. I mean, that's A, not sustainable. B, we're never going to be able to do it to that degree of excellence.
No.
It's just not.
We don't have the knowledge anymore.
No.
We also don't have some of the same materials, or the materials we would have to substitute it with are not easy to get, or they're not sustainable in any way.
Yeah. And the Nevada Supreme Court Justice.
Oh yeah, that's another one that this article mentions.
Which
I looked it up. It is pretty ugly.
It's ugly. Well, they basically tried to make it classically inspired.
Yes, they kind of, it's very much like a jigsaw puzzle of a building where they've taken things that they know are features of like the classical style and trying to slap them together, but it doesn't seem like they had a lot of like knowledge or intention or direction to the design. Yeah,
and I love how Friedman actually calls that kitsch, which I thought was a really good use of the word.
Okay, so I actually, reading this article, I got to really understand the word kitsch, because I've always used it very colloquially to describe something that's a little bit ugly or mundane, I think is how I would think of it. And this article describes kitsch in a very, like, as being associated with academic aesthetics, which at first tripped me up, but then I realized that it's because the proliferation, like having a kitsch object, if you look at the history of that object, it goes back to an academic source, a unique source that then essentially gets memeified, and that's what makes the final object kitsch, is like the repetition and maybe transformation of that object becoming an idea of itself.
Yeah, absolutely. You broke it down really well. I think I remember I took this course called Vulgar Culture in my bachelor, and we talked all about kitsch.
Awesome.
About the profane, about like erotic art. Like, it was really cool, and it was super, like, basically everything that's not highbrow.
Okay, yeah.
And I think something becomes kitsch, as you said, when it's broken down in academics, and there are so many repetitions of it that it becomes inauthentic, and it becomes very much, it comes to exist outside of its original context and time. And I think I mean, Trump is the most kitschy president of all time because everything he does has already been done before. Let's talk about it. The language. Yeah. It's giving 1984. It's giving Big Brother.
It's giving 1940.
The aesthetics. It's he's just so obsessed.
It's a cartoon.
Yeah, it's a cartoon. It's a caricature. He's obsessed with how he's portrayed. He's obsessed with the aesthetics of now the buildings that will be built in the future. And I think it's also quite harrowing because the article breaks down how Hitler and Stalin were also very concerned with the aesthetics of their regimes, with Hitler
and narrowing them and making them specific.
Right. And Hitler nitpicking every single artwork that he wanted in the museum he was creating in Munich, with Stalin being like obsessed with how the buildings were going to be built during his regime, and just also like sitting with the architects and making sure that actually some of the buildings were his designs. Yeah. Which I didn't even know that. And there's you can make the argument that we're concerningly seeing some repetition in style of leadership.
Yes, we're not the first to say this, so don't come for us. I hope that the crazies haven't found us yet. We have like 10 consistent listeners. There's absolutely no way.
No, I mean, I'm not even like, I don't even want to get into the politics side. I mean, I think art is also always political, but I'm just purely drawing parallels in art, the way that these leaders are engaging with aesthetics. Yes. And I think that we can just put that down and you can draw your own conclusions from that.
There's another great video essay by CJ the X, who I've talked about before on this channel, but they did a video that is all about the current aesthetics of dressing of conservative male politicians. Ooh. And it very much fits this definition of kitsch that I've now finally understood, wherein they're wearing suits, but they're wearing them incorrectly, like on purpose as an aesthetic choice.
Yeah.
Or they like for example, they don't wear a suit that fits them well. They wear one that is intentionally extremely tight so that their muscles or their just like gut looks bigger.
Yeah.
And they also are I don't even know if it's intentional. I think that it's probably just like a lack of knowledge of what looks good, but they're mixing and matching, like wearing a blazer with a dress pant or a khaki with a black tie jacket. Like they're just breaking these rules, which I'm not opposed to breaking rules. I'm just not convinced that they either know why they're doing it or that it's definitely not well intentioned.
Yeah.
It's like this weird power fuckery, which is exactly what this architecture, these aesthetics of making exactly the same always is going for as well.
Definitely. I think it also relates to the quote. So Friedman references Greenberg, who writes extensively or has written on kitsch culture.
This is a quote that's from like the 1930s.
Yeah, from the 1930s. And he says, the alternative to Picasso is not Michelangelo, but kitsch. And I think oftentimes when we see these kind of like, let's call it like a counter movement or like a contrarian movement to something classical. So we could even take the example of fashion. So a well-fitting suit. And then you would think that the alternative to that would maybe be
like working man's clothes,
or something that's very counterculture and just like really the complete opposite. But in an attempt to kind of be subversive, they've actually become a meme. They've actually they are now kitsch because it's something, it's
a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy until you arrive at this new thing that's sort of the same but disconnected.
Right. Very cool. I love that. So you'll link that.
Yeah.
Cool.
It was a really good video.
I love when we like also get these kind of other references that are not that are related, but also kind of like
not articles.
Not the article. Yeah.
I also want to talk a bit about some of the history that this article covers. Because this is not the first time that the American government is trying to establish rules for architecture. The federal government does make buildings, and so there have to be rules surrounding that. And what this executive order is getting rid of is a set of architectural guiding principles from the 1960s. And these guiding principles were done at a time that they were trying to not replicate the idea of fascism. They were actually very much against doing that. And this set of guidelines implicitly discouraged classical and other designs known for their beauty and declared that design must flow from the architectural profession's reigning orthodoxy to the federal government. So basically what that means is that federal architecture should be a reflection of the times and the people rather than an agenda.
Right.
Is sort of what I took from that. And these rules have resulted in new architecture that we can even consider to be more American. I honestly am surprised with how radical this administration is, that they aren't I feel like Trump supporters would expect him to be more in line with saying we're going to create something wholly new, wholly our own.
Innovative,
But he's not. These are not innovative people. They are going to go straight to the rule book. Like, they are not creative enough for something like that.
And also the irony here is not lost on me that, and this is something you said earlier when we were talking, that for an administration that is so against funding the arts and the humanities, promoting classical architecture is just so funny.
Exactly. It's not like they're going to educate anybody about that. They're just going to put the classical architecture up there because somebody else told them. Like, they're listening to other people. That is so not the image that they've put out for their admirers,
Yeah. I also love the word, or I think it's so interesting that they use the term beautification, because I will say I think that's where we can kind of take a different perspective as well. You can think of a city like Paris, where there is very much a uniform style of architecture, and that's also contributed to the beauty of Paris. And it is very
the identity
of Paris. And I think a lot of American cities have become a hodgepodge of different architectural styles. And it also kind of intrigues me that when Paris built a tower like Gare du Montparnasse, which is the big one that kind of sticks out, there was such a kind of visceral reaction, and people were very upset with how it kind of ruined the skyline. So, you know, I also think, and I have to say, my personal opinion of that tower is also, you know, negative.
Yeah.
Because I think it is an eyesore. Do cities always have to be beautiful? I mean,
no.
I'm
gonna say no.
Okay. But I also think, like, I mean, I agree with you, but I think maybe I'm also a bit of like, it's
also not objective. Like, it might be beautiful to the culture and the people that are living there, and I just don't find it to be very attractive. I'll be honest, when I visited Cologne, a lot of people love the architecture in Cologne, and it just personally was not for me. But I also thought of Paris as an example as I was reading this, because obviously from my perspective, reading this article, I'm going to be against the people that are trying to make a formalized style of art, because I'm against them as people. But I could easily think of Paris as a counter example to that, because Haussmann, not a great guy, but Haussmann, definitely not. But in the late 1800s, he redesigned Paris into the city that we know it today, and made it incredibly uniform in the style of, like, most of the buildings that line the main roads.
Yeah.
And it's a success, I would say, architecturally. Don't know where I want to go with it from there.
Maybe the point of architecture is not to beautify, but it should reflect
function as well as
function,
beauty.
But also the history of a city. And I think for me, in Paris, it feels like the kind of Haussmannian, like, style is a very natural evolution or step. Like, it was very much part of, like, it makes sense in the context. I think for me, what I struggle with this administration wanting to kind of reintroduce the classical style, it feels like ahistorical. It feels very, it doesn't feel like a natural progression per se. It also
feels forced.
Yeah. And that's where I have an issue with it. So maybe that's my stance. Like, if it is a natural kind of evolution of the aesthetics and the beautification comes from a movement or something new and innovative, like we're going to, or what I love in cities is kind of this greenification that's happening. So more parks and making sure that we're designing in a more green conscious way. But I think at the end of the day, I am against a uniform art style for a city, because I think cities are always constantly changing, and they should be spaces of creativity, and architects should not be excluded from that. And they should be able to also propose designs that are innovative and groundbreaking and weird.
This article is talking about, like, all of the restrictions that it's going to put on architects, and the AIA, which is like the Architects of America, basically. It's so paradoxical, because they are telling these architects, we're not even going to include you in, like, the think tanks that we have about a new project until later down the road. We're going to include normal people or people from the government in those discussions, and then we'll hire an architect to fulfill it, rather than bringing on the architect and incorporating them into the creative process. But then, while in one breath diminishing these architects and taking them down a notch, they're also referencing the research of the architects in their proclamation. Like, it's just so frustrating.
Yeah. Oh, it is. It was very well summarized, I think, by Friedman. I did enjoy this article, and I think I liked how she referenced also the past, and I loved the kitsch reference. And
one more thing from Greenberg's, her quote from Greenberg about kitsch that I highlighted in two different colors is, since these regimes cannot raise the cultural level of the masses, even if they wanted to, by anything short of a surrender to international socialism, they will flatter the masses by bringing all culture down to their level. Harsh.
Yeah, and a big criticism of Greenberg's text was that he's very elitist, which I actually do agree with as well. Like, yeah, I don't know. It's such an interesting thing. And I don't know if liking classical architecture makes you like, you know, this kind of, what's the word? Like a brainwashed part of the masses. I think you can very much think that that's the most beautiful style. I think the problem comes from any government mandating one style over others. Yeah. Like there should be room for variation and multiplicity in this regard. And because I'm also not, I have to say, I love a good Corinthian column. And I think if it's done right,
give me some buttresses.
Let's do it. But I think I also want to see, you know, like a Breuer building or something Art Deco, or maybe
variation, always variation.
Something ugly. It gives people something to talk about.
Yeah.
Like we can all complain about the Montparnasse Tower and be like, it's ugly. But it's there, and it engages people.
Specifically, the French are always going to complain. when they did the what do you call it, the pyramid in the Louvre, the glass pyramid, everyone thought it was the ugliest thing, and now it's just an iconic piece that goes right there. And they would never want you to take it away.
True. Some things can, you know, also opinions can change over time, but I think this is a good segue also to your article.
I agree. Yeah. We're talking about, you know, things changing over time, and also the role of communication within communities, like between architects as well. So my article is called The Afterlife of Fascist Colonial Architecture, a Critical Manifesto, and it's by Emilio Distretti and Alessandro Petti. And it uses a case study that is from the capital of Eritrea, from Asmara. And Eritrea, am I saying it right? Eritrea?
I say Eritrea, but
Eritrea. Well, let's both say Eritrea.
Okay.
So Eritrea was under Italian colonial rule.
Yes.
For what was it, about 40 years, from the 1890s through the 1940s, roughly. And in 2017, the city of Asmara, the capital city of Eritrea, was included in the UNESCO World Heritage sites. So it was declared a World Heritage Site. And this was a little bit of a complicated discussion, because you have an Italian style in a colonized city, and then you're saying that that is worthy of preservation and is part of that heritage, and who is it that's deciding that, and all of these things coming together. And there is this article also goes into what can we do with these buildings after the fascist regime is out. We still have this architecture that's a memory of it. How can we reuse those spaces or reimagine them to fit a new context? And that's what I was interested in when you pitched the idea of talking about fascist architecture, because I already kind of knew what we were going to talk about politically with that. And I wanted to bring something in that was maybe a little bit hopeful in terms of what can go beyond that.
Yeah, what comes after.
Yeah.
I thought it was really, really interesting, because the article also compares Eritrea and then to Ethiopia,
which is also colonized by the Italians.
Yeah, but
for like 5 years, though,
in a very different way. And a lot of Ethiopians will say that we were never colonized, and they're very proud of that as well.
Because I think it said it's the only country in Africa that wasn't colonized in that way.
But in the capital of Ethiopia, in Addis Ababa, there are also buildings still from that time period. But the way that they're engaging with those buildings is a lot different. So in Ethiopia, a lot of these buildings are being repurposed for I think one of the examples was a women's center for architects. So women in the field could, you know, have a space. It's very male dominated. So that was one of the kind of repurposing.
Well, that's what they were considering repurposing. And then they had a public forum in order to discuss, is this what we should do with the space, et cetera? What do you want? And this is kind of when they realized that the people in Ethiopia have a different connection with their Italian oligarchs than in Eritrea, because since they don't consider themselves to have been colonized, the idea of having to go through decolonization of these buildings just struck a bad note with them. Like, we don't need to go through that same process because we didn't have the same thing happen. These are just buildings now.
Yeah. And I think there was a lot more of an openness towards or people didn't even think about it as decolonization. They just thought about it, oh, this is just a building and it's here,
also
and we'll
reuse
it. Yeah,
because it's already very much built into the culture that you have resources that are available to you. You're going to reuse them. You're not going to knock it down, build something new. Like, you already have something there.
Yeah, and in Asmara we see more of a preservationist perspective, and that's very interesting if you consider, well, wouldn't the people of Eritrea be more inclined to repurpose? Wouldn't they want to really, I guess, reconquer that history, and that building is perhaps a symbol for, the decolonial process? And it's very interesting that
they want to preserve it. Maybe because they've lived alongside it for so long, and they've already done some of the decolonization in their minds, and so rather than part of an Italian history, they think of it as part of their own history as well.
Yeah, but also from a Western perspective, which we have to really acknowledge here. Yeah, I think the whole idea of the way that I think Westerners think of decolonization is also a Western way of thinking about decolonization. Yes. So the things that we can expect or imagine from other countries or people going through this process are not necessarily what those people will want or need. I think for us, when we think about decolonization, we think claiming back.
We have to get rid of every trace that we were there.
Yeah. Or, you think about also the removal of certain statues or buildings or monuments, anything that kind of references to the past. But in actuality, why do we think that that's the only route to?
Because we think we know best.
Exactly.
Because even when we're saying, oh, we were wrong for this, we still think we know the best way to fix it.
Let me show you how to decolonize. Yeah. I mean, this is such a paternalistic kind of way of engaging with these movements. And I think we also need to kind of check ourselves. I love that the article does actually acknowledge that and say, why can't we consider Ethiopians and Eritreans to act as custodians of Italian fascist architectural lineage?
I loved that. Yeah.
Is it not possible to envision reverse models of preservation that bear testimony of a shared decolonizing project between the South and the North, between ex-colonized and ex-colonizers? So this whole idea that that Europe or the West or the global North can teach people how to engage with their history is
especially because the British, like so many museums in Europe, have for decades, centuries now, have taken things from other countries and brought them to Europe and said, we're going to keep them good for you. This is positing that we can flip that on its head and actually have some of our colonial heritage, instead of trying to erase that and say, oops, our bad. It's now up to the places that we've left those remnants to decide how they want to remember it.
Exactly. They are the custodians of that heritage. It's not the Europeans' job to interfere with that process. And I think it's so interesting that in the beginning of the article, it's like, it's shocking that, these architectural kind of remnants are now on the World UNESCO Heritage Site. And, isn't that wrong? And isn't that just like maybe glorifying the Italian period of colonization there? Yeah. When in the actuality, if the Eritreans want it and are proud of that, and they have their own unique relationship to that architecture, then that's their call. And I think as a Westerner, you just fucking shut your mouth.
Learn, listen and learn.
Listen and learn. And just also consider that there are so many different kind of plural and varying experiences of how people relate to the architecture in their cities.
Mm-hmm. I also think this conversation about like who has the who has the responsibility to preserve these periods of history, depending on where they're located, and then the way that in these case studies that we have in this article, the way that they've assessed it, it reminds me of when we were in the forgery episode and talking about how art history now, when we look at it, is like very chronological and streamlined, but there's a more amorphous way that we can imagine art history that's more malleable. And this was just striking like a similar chord with me, that in the West we're so rigid in our thinking that we haven't approached it like more fractally, essentially, which also, from what I do know about some countries in Africa, have architectural designs, and like the way that they do city planning is more fractal than it is in the way that we do it in Europe and the West, where we have more of a grid system that we follow. So it is a different way of thinking, and we can open ourselves up to those possibilities to learn from it.
And learn from other cultures, other modes of understanding space and community. And I think this whole idea, like, that's the fascinating thing about art history and also conservation practice. It's so rooted in kind of the European ideal of the World Museum, or this kind of this idealized,
you got to get it all right now,
and the science of preservation, and we have to protect, and we have to protect these things from time, and I mean, I think it's just important to always kind of check yourself, and also when you're engaging with this type of literature, remember that we have such a specific lens when it comes to conservation, heritage, and also, like, now that, obviously, like, decolonial studies are becoming more and more common and they're more taught in universities, we need to accept that there's many different ways of a decolonial process to take place. It's not just a one size fits all, in the way that, unfortunately, a lot of, I think, Western scholarly work and even like art history has for so long been a one size fits all model. And we kind of just take that methodology and we apply it to every place in the world. And it's like, this is how you decolonize. This is how you preserve a painting. This is how you
and this is the right way, and this is the wrong way. And then with conservation specifically, you 10, 20 years go by and suddenly the whole entire thought process has changed, and it's like, oh, you still do it that way? That's so dated. Like, you just need to be a critical thinker and open yourselves up to lots of different possibilities. That's not just for conservation. That's for any academic exercise.
Yeah, true. But I thought this was a really, really interesting case study, and I really liked the comparison between Ethiopia and Eritrea, which are two countries with both such unique
it was interesting as well, because they talked about how some of the buildings that they're referencing in this article in both countries were built by the same people at the same time, but there's extremely different responses to it, because not anything related to the buildings themselves or the architects, but rather the location and the country that they're in. I really liked at the end of this article as well, they bring us back to just the current discussion of fascism and how it's slowly popping up in a lot of countries at the moment. But their kind of conclusion is that you can talk about these structures that we have that are the result of fascism, but and you can condemn them, but what's more important is to condemn fascism itself. And like, the buildings are a side effect of that. What you need to get at the root of the cause is the actual fascism, and that's has to be part of this conversation to keep it at the forefront of our minds.
I think that's also an argument that a lot of I guess people who are pro keeping remnants of Soviet monuments and this is a big discussion in Eastern Europe in the post-Soviet countries, where you still have statues of Lenin, for example, or just a lot of different sites that are directly, I guess, memorials for and memories of the time of the Soviet Union. And in certain countries, they've chosen to destroy those statues because they want to completely kind of distance themselves from that past. And a lot of them also in solidarity with Ukraine, actually.
Sure.
And other countries where the argument is, no, we want to keep them up because we want to remind ourselves that that's where we come from, and we want to kind of use those statues as a way of forcing people to remember education and making sure that we don't go back there. And I think that's, and you also see in the South,
I tend to believe that approach.
So
I understand like the protest element of it, and I'm actually fine with statues being destroyed in the name of protest.
Okay.
But I do like the idea of maybe keeping those. So like there are a lot of statues in the US have been
I was just
vandalized, spray painted, destroyed, whatever. In some Soviet statues, there are like Soviet statue parks in Eastern Europe, where they've collected them together so that you're going there, you know what you're going to be seeing. Okay. It's not like you're just turning the corner and boom, there's a racist. But in America, I don't know that we have any hope of establishing like something like a Confederate statue park, because both sides would hate that. The people who are pro-Confederacy would say, no, we don't want it to be removed from the place that it's supposed to be. And then the people that are not for the Confederacy are like, no, we don't want to glorify it. But it's just, honestly, it feels like it's mostly a problem of education in America.
What's more dangerous is to not showcase them at all, I think.
Yes.
To completely remove the history, because that's what I felt like in Indiana, going to school and to public school. I remember we skipped over the slavery chapter real quick. I mean,
polished up.
We get like, I think we would do World War I and II for like months. And then I guess prior to that, I guess when we were talking about the antebellum period and slavery, it was a quick week. I mean, it was much too short.
Yikes.
So, no, but I mean, this is a huge issue in the States, but also even here in the Netherlands, I think a lot of people, I mean, the history of Dutch colonization of Indonesia is also, it's not given its due diligence.
No.
And I think all like former colonial powers or current colonial powers are not doing that history justice. And
of course not. History is written by the winners.
And it's so funny that instead of allocating more resources to education and making sure that we're educating people so that history doesn't repeat itself, I think the
literacy rates are dropping. We're closing down libraries.
And we're gonna create new we're going to make more Parthenons. But they're not as good as the originals.
Definitely not. They're going to be kitsch.
We're going to do cheaper materials coming from an American audience. But honestly, I think this applies for everyone right now. With
be aware.
The rise of the global right. So I guess my closing thing that I said earlier to you as well is like, art is political, architecture is political. These things do not exist in a vacuum. It's important to understand like what type of art is created from the culture, or in the context from the culture that it's created in. And I think the way of looking at an artwork or a building as a structure or just a visual element is just never gonna give you the same insights as looking at it through the lens of what's happening politically, culturally, economically. So
and I also want to say, like, as silly and frustrating and juvenile as this administration is, they're doing this, they're making these rules because it is important, because
they know
architecture has an influence. It's what we live our lives in. It's a different form of art. Like I think that art that is something that you inhabit. So clothes, architecture, a lot of craft items, food, all of these things, they're a gateway to more variety in thinking, and we need to have variety in our options to engage with them in order for that to be replicated in our minds.
And with that,
source needed out.
Source needed is out.